It's been 2 weeks now, or maybe it's pushing 3. The days kind of bleed into each other in a place like this, where the only thing you hear is the hum of the ice machine down the hall and the smell of stale. Coffee hangs in the air like a ghost. 2 weeks ago, my daughter-in-law, Brenda, she helped me pack a bag and told me it was time to leave the home I built with my own 2 hands. Said her and my boy, Travis, needed the room for her family to spread out. Funny, ain't it? How a house that was big enough to hold a lifetime of memories with my Martha, God rest her soul, suddenly became too small for one old man. But what she doesn't know, what no one knows, is that the ink I just put to paper, right here on this wobbly little motel table, is tied to a secret I've kept buried for over 40 years. A secret that's big enough to swallow this whole town of Havenwood, Kentucky, and everything she thinks she owns. She saw a frail old man, you see, a piece of furniture that didn't match the new decor. She never once thought to look past the gray hair or the wrinkles etched around my eyes. She never imagined that the quiet man in the corner, the one who just nodded along, was sitting on a foundation that held up her entire world. The humiliation she served me on a platter, well, it wasn't an ending, my friend. It was a lit fuse, and it's been burning slow and steady in my chest ever since. This story, it ain't about revenge. Not really. It's about a lesson. A lesson she's about to learn, a lesson that's been coming for a long, long time. So, if you've got a moment, pull up a chair. I reckon it's time someone heard the whole truth from the very beginning. You subscribe to this channel, and I promise you, I'll tell you everything. Before Brenda, before all this bitterness settled in my bones, that house was my sanctuary. It was more than just wood and nails. It was a living, breathing thing. I remember the day I laid the foundation. Must have been back in 75, or was it 76? The year doesn't matter so much as the feeling. The summer sun was high and hot, the kind that makes the air shimmer above the dirt roads, and the sound of the cicadas was a constant hum. My Martha, she'd bring me lemonade in a big glass pitcher, condensation dripping down the sides, her smile brighter than that Kentucky sun. She'd stand there, hands on her hips, watching me work, and she'd say, "Elmer, you're not just building a house, you're building our whole world." And she was right. Every single floorboard, every window pane, I put 'em in myself. I knew the song each step made when you walked down the hall, the way the late afternoon sun would spill across the kitchen floor in a perfect golden rectangle. My boy Travis, he grew up within those walls. I remember him as a little fella, no bigger than a sack of flour, his hands always covered in dirt from the garden. He'd follow me around with his little plastic hammer, tapping on walls, trying to help his daddy. His laughter was the music of that house. We were happy, genuinely happy. It was a simple life, sure. I was a contractor, worked hard, came home tired, but satisfied. We went to church on Sundays, had potlucks in the backyard, knew all our neighbors by name. It was a good life, a solid one. I thought I was building a legacy, something that would stand long after I was gone, a safe harbor for my son and his family. I never once imagined I'd be the one cast out from it. But even back then, looking back on it now with these old eyes, I can see the little cracks starting to form. Like a hairline fracture in a pane of glass you don't notice until the whole thing shatters. It was subtle things. When Travis brought Brenda home for the first time, I felt a shift. She was polished, from the city. She'd walk through our home, my Martha's home, and you could see her eyes calculating, measuring. She'd compliment a piece of furniture my Martha had picked out, but her smile never quite reached her eyes. It was the kind of smile that was more of a judgment. I told myself I was being a foolish old man, that I was just protective of my boy. I wanted to see the best in her, for his sake. Then there was the matter of the land. The acre behind our house, the one with the big oak tree where Travis had his swing. I'd bought that parcel years ago, thinking one day he might build his own home there, right next to us. It was a dream of mine. After Martha passed, I signed the deed over to him as a wedding gift. Just gave it to him, free and clear. I remember the day I did it. He and Brenda were standing in the kitchen. I handed him the folder, and he just glanced at it. "Thanks, Dad," he said, before tucking it under his arm. Brenda, she took the folder from him, opened it, and her eyes scanned that paper, not with gratitude, but with appraisal. Like she was checking the value of a stock. There was no hug, no real thank you. Later that week, I overheard her on the phone in the living room talking to her mother. She said, "It's a start. At least we have some collateral now." Collateral. That's what my dream for them became. Not a future, not a home for their children, but collateral. It was a small thing, a quiet thing, but it planted a seed of unease in my heart that never truly went away. At the time, I just pushed it down. I told myself she was just being practical. But now, sitting in this lonely room, I see it for what it was. It was the first shovelful of dirt they used to start burying me. I just didn't know that then. I didn't know that that beautiful, sun-drenched kitchen would one day be the last place I ever truly felt at home. The first real crack in the dam, the one that showed me the flood was coming, happened about a year after Martha passed away. It had to do with my workshop out back. That little shed wasn't just a place I kept my tools. It was my sanctuary. It smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, a scent I always found more comforting than any church incense. It was where I'd go to think, to work with my hands, to feel close to the man I'd always been. Inside, amongst the saws and the planers, was Martha's old rocking chair. It was a simple thing, made of oak, but she'd sat in it every single evening while she was carrying Travis, humming little tunes that I can't for the life of me remember the names of anymore. The memory of the sound is gone, but the feeling of peace it gave me, that stuck to my ribs. After she was gone, I couldn't bring myself to keep the chair in the house. It felt too empty. So I kept it in the workshop where I could see it every day, a quiet monument to her. Well, one Saturday morning, Brenda came to me with that sweet as honey voice she uses when she wants something. She said they were thinking of converting the workshop into a little guest house. For when her parents visited, she said, my heart just sank. I looked at her and I tried to explain. "Brenda, that's my space. My tools are in there." Martha's chair. She put a hand on my arm, a touch that felt more like a restraint than a comfort. "Oh, Elmer, don't be silly," she said, smiling that smile that never touched her eyes. "We'll help you clean it all out. We can put the important stuff in the attic. It'll be so much more useful this way." Travis just stood behind her, nodding along like he always did, his eyes fixed on the floor. I was tired. The grief was still a heavy coat on my shoulders, and I didn't have the strength for a fight, so I made them promise me. "Just the chair," I said, my voice feeling thin. "You pack away my tools, that's fine. But you promise me you'll take care of Martha's chair. Don't let anything happen to it," she promised. She looked me right in the eye and said, "Of course, Elmer, we promise." I went away for a few days to visit my cousin over in Lexington. I thought it'd be easier than watching them dismantle my life's work. When I came back, the workshop was sterile. The walls were painted a lifeless beige. The floor was covered in some cheap laminate. The smell of sawdust was gone, replaced by the chemical smell of fresh paint. I walked up to the attic, my heart pounding a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. My tools were there, tossed in a corner under a dusty tarp, but the chair, it was gone. I searched every corner, behind old trunks and boxes, praying I was just overlooking it, but it wasn't there. I went inside and found them in the kitchen, laughing about something on the television. I stood in the doorway until Brenda finally noticed me. "What's wrong, Elmer? You look like you've seen a ghost." My voice was quiet, but it felt like the loudest sound in the world. "The chair. Where's Martha's chair?" She just waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, that old thing. It was all rickety, honey. One of the legs was wobbly. We put it out on the curb and a junk collector picked it up. I think he gave Travis $20 for it. $20, my wife's memory. The place where my son was rocked before he was even born. Sold for $20. I looked at Travis, hoping to see a flicker of shame, of regret. But there was nothing. He just shrugged. Dad, it was just an old chair. We needed to make space. That was the moment. That was the betrayal. It wasn't about the wood or the money. It was about the cold, hard fact that the things that held the most value for me, the sacred pieces of my past, were worthless to them. They saw history as junk. They saw sentiment as clutter. And in that moment, a quiet little switch flipped in my mind. I realized that if they could do that to Martha's memory, they could do it to anything. They could do it to me. That very next week, I took a drive. I didn't go to a doctor or a preacher. I went to a lawyer in the next county over, a fella nobody in heaven would knew. And that's when I started building my real foundation, the one they couldn't see. I started the construction company under a different name, began moving my assets, building a fortress of paper and numbers around myself. I did it quietly, in the dark, because I knew, after that day, I was alone in that house. I was just a ghost they hadn't gotten around to sweeping out yet. And as I lay in bed that night, the silence in the house felt different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, like the stillness before a storm, and I knew in my gut that the wind and the rain were coming for me. After the business with Martha's chair, a chill settled into that house that had nothing to do with the seasons. It was a quiet cold, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you feel old. It wasn't one big thing, not at first. It was 1,000 little paper cuts. It was in the way Brenda started redecorating the living room, the one Martha had spent months picking out the colors for. One day I came downstairs and the family photos on the mantelpiece were gone. All the pictures of me and Martha, our wedding, the day Travis was born. They were replaced with newer photos of her and Travis of her side of the family. When I asked where they went, she just smiled and said, "Oh, I put them in a nice box for safekeeping in the closet. We needed to make it look a little more modern, you know?" Safekeeping. Like my whole life was something to be stored away and forgotten. Then came the food. Martha knew I loved my steak and potatoes, a simple man's meal. But Brenda, she was all about health. She'd make these green things. Salads with strange leaves and little seeds that got stuck in your teeth. She'd put a plate in front of me and say, "This is better for your heart, Elmer." She never asked what I wanted. It was decided for me. I was spoken about in the third person, even when I was sitting right there at the table. "He shouldn't be out in the yard so long," she'd say to Travis, right over the top of my head. "He needs his rest." I started to feel like a ghost in my own home, a shadow they moved around as they pleased. My voice, which had once been the final word under that roof, had faded to a whisper they no longer seemed to hear. I remember one afternoon, I was sitting on the porch swing, watching the cars go by, and my mind drifted back to the winter of, must have been 82 or 83. There was a bad recession on, and one of my biggest contracts fell through right before Christmas. Money was tighter than a new pair of shoes. I remembered the look of worry on Martha's face, and I told her not to fret. For 2 solid weeks, I took every side job I could find. I was up on Mr. Abernathy's roof in the freezing rain, patching a leak. I was in the miller's basement, fixing their furnace when it was 10 degrees outside. My hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold, but I didn't care. All I cared about was seeing the light in little Travis's eyes on Christmas morning, and I did it. We had a beautiful Christmas, a big tree and more presents than we could afford, all because I broke my back to make it happen. I was the provider. I was the shield that kept the cold world from touching my family. And as I sat there on that swing, 40 years later, the memory was so clear, so real, I could almost feel the chill of that winter wind. I looked through the screen door and saw Travis and Brenda in the kitchen. She was pointing at a calendar, and he was just nodding, that same vacant nod. I was the man who had wrestled with the world for them, and now I wasn't even trusted to decide what to have for my own supper. That evening, the plot twist, as they say, came knockin'. I was looking for an envelope with a new catalog for my fishing gear, something I looked forward to. I couldn't find it in the usual pile of mail. On a hunch, I walked into the little room they'd turned into a home office. And there, in a drawer of Brenda's desk, was a stack of my mail. My name, clear as day, but the envelopes were already opened. My heart started to beat a little faster. I thumbed through them. My bank statement, a letter from my old army buddy, and then I saw it. An official-looking envelope from the Social Security Administration. Inside was a form, mostly filled out in Brenda's neat, tidy handwriting. It was a representative payee application. A form to give her legal control over my pension, my Social Security checks. All it needed was a signature. My signature. I carefully put the papers back, slid the drawer shut without a sound, and walked out of that room. My hands weren't even shaking. It was a strange kind of cold calm that settled over me. This wasn't about making the house look modern anymore. This wasn't about healthy food or closet space. This was a plan. I wasn't just a person to them. I was a problem they were actively trying to solve, a loose end they needed to tie up. I realized I was being erased, slowly and deliberately, like a name being scrubbed from a deed. And I knew then, I wasn't just fighting for a memory anymore. I was fighting to exist at all. The days that followed my discovery in that desk drawer were the strangest of my life. I carried the knowledge of this scheme around like a stone in my pocket. It was heavy, and I was always aware of it, yet on the outside I said nothing. A deep and profound silence became my shield. I'd watch Brenda bustle around the kitchen, humming a tune as she prepared one of her tasteless, healthy meals, and I'd see the lie behind her smile. I'd watch Travis come home from work, slump into his armchair, and turn on the television, and I'd see the weakness, the cowardice in his averted eyes. They'd talk to me, ask me how my day was, and I'd nod and say, "Fine." How do you explain that your day was spent contemplating the fact that your own child is planning to seize control of your life? There are no words for that kind of heartbreak. The silence in that house grew so loud it would press in on my eardrums. It sat with us at the dinner table, an invisible guest, and it made every bite of food taste like ash. I tried one last time to reach my son. I truly did. It was a Sunday afternoon, I think. Or maybe a Saturday. The day of the week gets fuzzy, but I remember the quality of the light. It was that soft, golden light of late autumn. Brenda was out with her friends. Travis was in the backyard, raking the last of the leaves. I went out and stood beside him, watching the rhythmic scrape of the rake on the grass. I started talking about the old days, about a project we did together when he was a teenager. We'd built a shed for our neighbor, Mrs. Gable. I remembered how proud he was of the first wall he framed all by himself. I said to him, "You remember that, son? You had a real knack for it. You had good hands." He didn't stop raking. He just grunted and said, "Yeah, Dad, I remember." A lot of good that does me now, pushing paper at a desk all day. There was no warmth in his voice, just tired resentment. He didn't want to remember. He didn't want to connect with me over a memory of honest work. He just wanted to finish his chore, and in that moment, I let the silence win. I turned and walked back inside, and the stone in my pocket felt heavier than ever. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, and my mind went to my real secret. Not the pain, but the power. After the incident with Martha's chair, I did more than just open a new bank account. I took the inheritance my own father had left me, a sum nobody, not even Martha, knew the true extent of, and I started something. I used my knowledge, my name in the contracting world, the one people trusted, and I founded a new company. On paper, it was called Cornerstone Holdings LLC, a quiet, unassuming name. I was the sole anonymous owner. While Elmer Harlan, the retired old man, was being slowly erased in his own home, Cornerstone Holdings was buying up land. It was investing in small businesses all over the state. It was the silent partner in a dozen new housing developments. While Brenda was plotting to get her hands on my few $1,000s a month in Social Security, I was signing checks worth more than she could dream of. I built it as a fortress, a way to reclaim the dignity they were stripping from me piece by piece. I'd sit in my armchair, pretending to be asleep, and listen to them talk about their money troubles, about how much they needed a new car or a vacation, and all the while, in a safe deposit box in a bank 3 towns over, were the documents, the deeds, the proof that I could have bought them that car with the interest I made in a single afternoon. I never touched the money for myself. I still wore the same old shirts. I still drove the same old truck. Part of me, the foolish, hopeful part, I suppose, was building it for them. I thought one day I'd reveal it all, that I'd be the hero again, the provider who could solve all their problems and finally earn back their respect. But lying there in the dark, with the sound of their soft snores coming from down the hall, a new thought began to take root in my mind. The weight of my silence about their betrayal was matched only by the weight of my silence about my power. And for the first time, I started to wonder if I'd been wrong all along. Maybe I shouldn't have been hiding it. Maybe it was time to let the truth, all of it, come out into the light. For the next week or so, I lived inside my own head. The world outside my thoughts felt muffled and distant. I was locked in a debate with myself, a silent courtroom trial where I was the prosecutor, the defendant, and the judge. One part of me, the angry part, wanted to march into the living room, slap those papers from Brenda's desk down on the coffee table, and watch the whole charade crumble. I wanted to see the look on her face when the lie was exposed. I wanted to force my son to finally look me in the eye and choose a side. But then, another voice, a quieter, more tired voice, would whisper back. "And what then, Elmer? What happens after the shouting is done?" The family would be shattered, whatever was left of it. The hate would be out in the open, a poison with no antidote. And I'd be alone. Truly and utterly alone. Is that a victory? Or is it better to just endure? To keep my secret fortress of wealth to myself and live out my days as a quiet observer in my own home? A man with a king's ransom in his pocket that he can't spend on a moment's peace? My mind kept drifting back to a time long ago. Back to the late 70s, I think it was. The years get a bit tangled now, like old fishing line. But I remember the feeling of it. I had a partner back then, a fella named Jedediah Banks. Jed was smooth where I was rough. He handled the books, the client meetings, all the things I wasn't good at. I was the one on the sites, the one with the sawdust in his hair and the calluses on his hands. We built a good little business together. I trusted him. I trusted him like a brother. Then one day, the whole house of cards came down. Turns out Jed had been keeping 2 sets of books, one for me to see and one for him to steal from. He'd been bleeding the company dry for years, talking out loans in our name and pocketing the cash. When it all came crashing down, he disappeared, vanished, left me with a mountain of debt, a line of angry suppliers, and a reputation in tatters. I lost everything. We almost lost the house Martha loved so dearly. I remember standing in the kitchen with her, the foreclosure notice on the table between us. I felt like less than a man. I had failed her, and I had failed my little boy. The shame of being fooled so completely, of having my trust so utterly betrayed, it brands you. It changes the way you walk through the world. I built myself back up, of course. I worked twice as hard, took jobs no one else wanted, and slowly, painstakingly, I clawed my way back. But I never forgot the feeling of watching everything you built turn to dust because you trusted the wrong person. And that, I reckon, is why I stayed silent now. That old shame was a ghost standing right behind me, whispering in my ear. It told me to be careful, to not make a scene, to not risk another open battle. It told me to retreat to my fortress and guard what I had left. The fight in me felt like a dying ember. I was old. I was tired. I looked at my reflection in the dark window pane one night, and I saw a weary man who just wanted some peace. I thought, maybe this is just how it has to be. You accept the humiliation, you hold on to your secret dignity, and you wait for the end. I was so close to letting go, to just letting the current pull me under. I was tired of swimming. But then, on Thursday morning, I overheard something. A phone call Brenda was making in the kitchen when she thought I was napping in my chair. It wasn't the whole plan, just a piece of it. But it was enough. In that one instant, as her words floated into the living room, all the weariness, all the resignation, it just evaporated. And something hot and sharp took its place. I knew then that silence wasn't safety. It was surrender. And I wasn't ready to surrender. The voice I heard from the kitchen that Thursday morning was syrupy sweet, the way Brenda's gets when she's on the phone with one of her church friends. She thought I was sound asleep in my armchair, but I've always been a light sleeper, a habit from years of listening for a baby's cry in the night. I couldn't catch every single word, mind you. My hearing ain't what it used to be, and she was keeping her voice low. But the kitchen door was just a crack open, and some words floated out as clear as a bell. I heard the name Dr. Miller, our family doctor for 30 years. And I heard the phrase cognitive assessment, and then the words that sent a bolt of ice through my veins. It's the only way we can move forward ... for his own good. I closed my eyes and slowed my breathing, pretending to be lost in a dream, but behind my eyelids, my mind was racing. The form in her desk drawer wasn't enough. They needed a doctor to declare me unfit. They were moving on to the next stage of the plan. And just like that, the whole climate in the house changed. The next morning, I woke up to a smell I hadn't smelled in years. Bacon frying. Brenda was at the stove, humming that same tune she'd been humming on the phone, and she turned to me with a brilliant smile. "Good morning, Elmer. I thought you'd enjoy a real breakfast today." She put a plate piled high with bacon, eggs, and toast in front of me. Travis was at the table, his newspaper folded neatly, and he actually looked up and smiled. "Morning, Dad. Sleep well?" It was all so pleasant, so normal. And it was the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced. This sudden kindness was a weapon. It was a sweet poison meant to lull me into a state of docile contentment. They were fattening the calf before the slaughter. The suggestion for a checkup came 2 days later. Brenda approached me, her face a perfect mask of loving concern. "Elmer, honey, I'm a little worried about you. You seem so tired lately. I made an appointment for you with Dr. Miller, just a routine checkup to make sure everything's all right." I looked from her concerned face to my son's, who was nodding in agreement. I knew if I refused, it would only prove their point, give them ammunition to say I was being difficult and confused. So I just nodded slowly and said, "All right, dear, if you think it's best." The doctor's office felt cold. Colder than usual. Doctor Miller came in, the same man who had stitched up Travis's chin when he fell off his bike, the same man who held my hand for a moment after he told me Martha's fight was over. I trusted him, but he wasn't the same man. He had a tight, professional smile on his face, and he spoke to me with a forced slowness, like I was a child who couldn't keep up. "Now, Elmer," he said, sitting down across from me, "Brenda tells me you've been a bit forgetful lately." He started asking me questions. "Who is the president? What year is it? Can you draw a clock for me?" It wasn't a checkup. It was an interrogation. I could feel Brenda's influence in every patronizing question, in every skeptical glance. He was another soldier in her army now. Another person who looked at me and saw a problem to be managed. I answered his questions calmly, my voice even, but inside, a silent scream was building. On the ride home, the false harmony was back in full force. Brenda chattered on about how well it went, how proud she was of me for going. I just stared out the window at the familiar streets of Havenwood passing by. I saw it all then, the whole ugly tapestry they were weaving. The isolation, the financial takeover, and now the attempt to legally erase my mind. They weren't just after my money or my house. They were after my name, my credibility, my very identity. They thought their little show was working. They thought I was just a tired old man, easily fooled by a plate of pancakes and a few kind words. But as I sat there in my armchair that evening, smiling right back at their phony faces, I saw the full picture for the first time. This wasn't a robbery. It was a cage. And they weren't just building the walls around me. They were making sure the whole world thought I belonged inside it. The results from Dr. Miller's assessment came back a week later. Brenda sat me down at the kitchen table, a single sheet of paper in her hand, her face a perfect portrait of feigned sorrow. The report said I had mild cognitive decline, that I was showing signs of age-related memory impairment. It was all couched in soft medical language, but the meaning was as sharp as a shard of glass. I was losing my mind. Dr. Miller suggested assistance with financial and medical decisions. I looked at the paper, then I looked at her, and I just nodded. I played the part of the confused, agreeable old man. But on the inside, a fire was hardening into steel. I knew then that their words, my words, none of it mattered anymore. The only thing that would matter now was proof. Hard, undeniable proof of their real motives. For days I just watched and listened, sifting through my own memories, looking for a misplaced clue. And then it came to me. It wasn't a dramatic flashback, just a whisper of a memory from, it must have been last spring when the forsythia bushes were in full bloom. The specific time is hazy. You know how that is. But the words, they suddenly came back to me, clear as day. Brenda had been on the phone with her sister. I was walking through the living room, and I heard her say, her voice tight with frustration, if we could just leverage the main asset, all of this would go away. It's just sitting there, not being used. At the time, it was just noise, a piece of a conversation that wasn't mine. I probably thought she was talking about their own savings. But now, sitting in the shadow of Dr. Miller's report, I knew. I was the main asset. My house was the main asset. It was just sitting there. I had to wait for the right moment. It came the following Friday. They were going out to dinner and a movie with some friends of hers. I remember the relief I felt when I heard the car pull out of the driveway. The house was finally quiet. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was an opportunity. I went straight to the little office room, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I wasn't just aimlessly searching this time. I was on a mission. I bypassed the drawer with my own mail and went to a small, locked metal box tucked away on the bottom shelf of the closet. I'd seen Brenda put a key she kept on her car keychain in there once or twice. I'd spent my life working with my hands, and a cheap lock like that wasn't much of a challenge. A bent paperclip and a minute of patience was all it took. The box wasn't full of documents about me. It was full of documents about them. And as I read them, a whole new layer of the story peeled itself back. There were credit card statements with balances that made my eyes water. Letters from a bank, written in stern, unforgiving language, about a business loan that was in default, a loan for a failed boutique her brother had started. A loan it turned out Travis had co-signed, and then, at the very bottom, I found the centerpiece. It was a folder from a mortgage company. Inside was a preliminary application, an application for a home equity line of credit. Against my house, my home, the one that had been paid off in full for 20 years. They had already had it appraised, and the number they'd written down was staggering. The plan was as simple as it was monstrous. They were going to use the doctor's report to get control, mortgage my home to the hilt, and use the money to pay off their and her family's crushing debts. I put every single paper back exactly where I found it, relocked the box, and put it back on the shelf. I was back in my armchair, the television on, a full 10 minutes before their car lights swept across the living room window. They walked in, laughing, asking if I'd had a nice, quiet evening. I told them I did. My heart was no longer racing. It was cold and steady, like a block of ice. I finally understood. I wasn't a father to them anymore. I wasn't a person they were trying to help. I was a solution to a math problem. I was the last untapped well they could draw from before their whole world ran dry. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that a person will do absolutely anything to get a bucket into that well. With Dr. Miller's report in hand, Brenda began to tighten the screws. It was done with a terrible, suffocating kindness. My car keys vanished from the hook by the door. "Just for safety, Elmer," she'd said, patting my hand. "We'll drive you anywhere you need to go." My mail no longer appeared on the little table in the hall. She'd bring it to me, already opened. "Just helping you keep things organized, honey. Don't want you to worry about a thing." They were building a prison around me, and the bars were forged from their loving concern. Every small freedom I had was methodically taken away, not with a fight, but with a gentle, patronizing smile that made my stomach turn. I was a child in my own home, and my keepers were my son and the woman who had stolen his spine. The true depth of my isolation, however, I discovered out in my own yard. It was a Tuesday, I think, a crisp autumn day. I just needed to feel the sun on my face, to breathe air that wasn't thick with their lies. I was walking near the fence line when I saw my neighbor Jim Abernathy pruning his rose bush. I've known Jim for, well, it feels like my whole life. We coached our boys' Little League team together. I helped him build his deck. He helped me fix my roof after that big hailstorm in '98. I thought if there was one person left who saw me as just Elmer, it would be him. I called out a hello. He turned, and the smile on his face was wrong. It was a fragile, sad smile, the kind you give someone at a funeral. He spoke to me slowly, loudly, as if I were standing 100 feet away instead of 10. "Elmer, good to see you out and about. You doing okay? Brenda keeping good care of you?" Every word was coated in pity. I tried to talk about the weather, about his roses, but he just kept nodding and saying, "That's nice, Elmer. You just take it easy now." I saw it then. She had gotten to him. She had gotten to all of them. She had walked her story up and down our street, planting seeds of concern, painting a picture of a poor, confused old man whose loving family was struggling to cope. I was no longer a neighbor. I was a burden they all had to watch over. That night, they sat me down for what Brenda called a family meeting. It was just the three of us in the living room, the room that felt less like mine with every passing day. She held a brochure in her hands. Her face was arranged in an expression of deep, solemn care. "Elmer," she began, her voice soft and steady, "we love you so much. And because we love you, we have to do what's best for you, even if it's hard." She slid the brochure across the coffee table. It was for a place called Willow Creek Assisted Living. Pictures of smiling, white-haired people playing bingo and sitting in sterile, sunlit rooms stared up at me. "Dr. Miller was very clear," she said, looking me straight in the eye. "This was the gigantic lie, the one that would change everything. He said your condition requires round-the-clock monitoring, a place where professionals can make sure you're always safe." A sound came out of my throat. It might have been a word. It might have been a gasp. He never said that," I whispered. "He said I needed assistance." Brenda's eyes filled with tears, the fake kind that she could summon on command. "Oh, honey, you're confused. You don't remember it clearly. We're just doing what the doctor ordered." I turned my head, my last hope, and looked at my son. Et Travis. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he stared at a spot on the carpet as if it held the secrets of the universe. "Dad," he mumbled, his voice thick. "She's right. It's for the best. They have activities there." And that was it, the final betrayal. My own son, my own flesh and blood, sitting there and validating a lie that would cast me out of my own life. They told me I had a week to get my things together. Her family needed the space. I just sat there in my armchair long after they went to bed, the brochure for Willow Creek resting on my lap. I looked around the shadowed room at the faint outlines of the furniture, at the ghosts of 50 years of living. They had won. They had used my trust, my history, my love for my own son as levers to pry me out of my world. Every door I could have knocked on had been bolted shut by her whispers. I was completely and utterly cornered. And as the grandfather clock in the hall chimed its lonely midnight bells, I finally understood. I wasn't being asked to leave my home. I was being evicted from my own life. For 2 full days I let them see what they wanted to see, a broken man. I'd sit in my armchair for hours, not saying a word. I'd nod when they spoke to me. I even let Brenda help me pack a small suitcase with a few shirts, some socks, and my toothbrush. I was a ghost haunting the last few hours of my own life, and they moved around me with a quiet, efficient pity. I think, for a little while, I believed it myself. It's a strange thing, you know. A man can forget his own strength when everyone around him keeps telling him he has none left. I'd look at the picture of Martha I kept on my nightstand, and I'd whisper to her in my head, "I'm sorry, honey. I'm just too tired to fight anymore." I was ready to let the story end this way, with a whimper. The thing that changed it all was small. It was a laugh. It was Wednesday evening, 2 days before my scheduled departure to Willow Creek. I was supposed to be napping. They were in the kitchen, and Brenda was on the phone. I heard her laugh, a loud, triumphant sound that was utterly out of place in our quiet, sad house. "No, you won't believe the deal we're getting," she said into the phone. "The contractor said he can have the new floors in and the whole place repainted before the end of the month. It'll be like he was never even here. Like he was never even here." Those words? They weren't just planning to move me out. They were planning to scrub away any evidence that I had ever existed within those walls. And in that moment, something inside me that had gone cold and dormant for years, something that had survived Jedediah Banks and 1,000 other heartbreaks, it sparked back to life. The tiredness vanished, and a cold, clear purpose settled in its place. That night, after the house was dark and silent, I didn't go to sleep. I put on my old work boots, the ones with the steel toes, and I went down into the basement. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and 50 years of memories. They never came down here. It was my space. I walked over to the far wall, the one that formed the foundation under the original hearth. To anyone else, it was just a wall of cinder blocks. But I had laid these blocks. I knew their secrets. I took a small crowbar from my old toolbox and wedged it into a seam that looked just like all the others. With a soft groan, one of the blocks came loose. And behind it, nestled in the dark, cool space, was a steel lockbox. Not the cheap one from Brenda's closet. This one was fireproof, waterproof, and heavy as a tombstone. This was the heart of Cornerstone Holdings. This was the real fortress. I carried it upstairs to the kitchen table and opened it. Under the moonlight filtering through the window, I laid them out. The deeds to 47 properties across 3 counties. The original incorporation papers for my company. The stock certificates for majority shares in businesses they used every day. And the bank statements for accounts they couldn't even imagine. I wasn't looking at paper. I was looking at power. The power they understood. The power they respected. And I made my decision. I wasn't going to fight them with words. That was a battle I had already lost. I was going to fight them with numbers, with acquisitions, with the cold, hard language of the world they had chosen to live in. I packed none of my clothes. I emptied the suitcase Brenda had packed for me and filled it instead with the most important files from that box. The next morning, when she came to wake me, I was sitting in my chair, dressed, the suitcase at my feet. I looked up at her, my face as blank as I could make it, and said, "I'm ready." I let them drive me. I let them give me one last pitying hug as they dropped me off at the entrance to this cheap motel, 2 towns over. They thought they were dropping off their problem. They thought they had won. They drove away, probably already discussing paint colors. They had no idea what they had just done. They thought they had evicted an old man. They had just released a majority shareholder. The first 48 hours in that dingy motel room were a blur of quiet, calculated action. The room itself was a miserable place, with a lumpy mattress and a faint smell of bleach, but it became my war room. From a cheap chair that wobbled, I commanded a silent army. The first call was to a liar I'd had on retainer for years through Cornerstone, a man in a big city high-rise who had never known my real name until that morning. When I explained who I was and laid out the documents I had, there was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by a level of respect I hadn't heard in a man's voice in a long, long time. I told him what I wanted to do. I didn't shout. I didn't rage. I gave my instructions with the calm precision of a man ordering lumber for a job site. By Monday afternoon, the first domino fell. I had Cornerstone Holdings, my anonymous company, purchase a controlling interest in the manufacturing firm where Travis had worked for 20 years. That evening, my phone rang. It was him. The panic in his voice was a raw, naked thing. "Dad? Dad, they fired me." Just like that. Said the company has new ownership and they're restructuring. 20 years, Dad. What am I gonna do? I just listened. I let the silence stretch out. "That's a shame, son," I finally said, my voice even. "That's a real shame. I'm sorry to hear it." I offered no advice, no comfort. I just let him sit with the consequences. The next day, it was Brenda. She wasn't panicking. She was screaming. Her voice was shrill and ugly over the phone. "Elmer, did you forget to pay the bills before you left? The lights are out. The water, the gas, everything's been shut off. What is going on?" I let her yell until she ran out of breath. "That sounds stressful, Brenda," I said, as calmly as if she were talking about the weather. "I hope you can get that sorted out." The final move was the most personal. Years ago, I'd loaned them money for a new roof, a loan they never paid back and I had long since forgiven. But I had never legally released the lien against the property. On Wednesday, my lawyer reactivated it. On Thursday, a notice of foreclosure was delivered to my front door. That's what finally brought him to me. On Friday evening, there was a desperate knock on the door of my motel room. I opened it to find my son, Travis. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes were wrinkled, and he looked 10 years older than he had a week ago. He stumbled into the room and just fell into the one flimsy chair, his head in his hands. He started talking, the words tumbling out in a torrent of apologies and pleas. He said Brenda was sorry that they had made a terrible mistake, that they'd do anything. He begged me to help them, to make it all stop. I let him talk until he was finished. I walked over to the cheap coffee maker and poured a cup of black coffee into a styrofoam cup and handed it to him. I sat on the edge of the lumpy bed and looked at him, really looked at him for a long time. Then I asked him the only question that mattered. "If I help you, son," I said, my voice quiet but hard, "if I make this all go away, will you stand up to her? Will you tell her that I am your father and I will be treated with respect in my own home?" The silence that followed was the most painful of my entire life. I watched him wrestle with it. He looked up at me, his eyes swimming with tears, and the truth, when it came, was a brutal and honest surrender. "I don't know, Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. I want to." but I don't know if I can make her. I don't know. In that moment, the victory I had engineered felt like ashes in my mouth. I had all the power, all the money, all the control, but I couldn't buy my own son's backbone. It felt like I had lost. He must have seen the look on my face, the flicker of defeat, because in his desperation, he finally told me the whole truth. "It's not just that, Dad," he choked out, looking at the floor. "It's something that happened years ago, after the kids were born. I made a mistake, a bad one. I almost lost everything, my job, all of it. Brenda, she knows. She's the only one who knows. She's been holding it over me ever since. If I ever truly cross her, she burned my whole world to the ground. I'm trapped, Dad." He looked up at me then, and for the first time, I didn't see a coward. I saw a man living in a different kind of cage than mine, one I had never known existed. He was a prisoner, too. And this new truth, this final, ugly secret, changed everything all over again. Looking at my son in that shabby motel room, I didn't see the man who had let me down. I saw a scared boy, the same one who used to run to me when he'd scraped his knee. I saw a man who had been living in a prison of shame for a decade, and I understood that Brenda's cruelty wasn't just aimed at me. It was the chain she used to hold him. A wave of something fierce and paternal, something I thought had been buried under years of disappointment, rose up in me. I knew then that this wasn't about punishing them anymore. It was about saving what was left of my son. I put my hand on his shoulder. "Go home, Travis," I said, my voice steady and clear. "You get your wife and you both come back here on Sunday afternoon. Not a request, son. You be here." When they walked into the room that Sunday, Brenda had a storm cloud on her face, ready for a fight. Travis just looked terrified. I didn't say a word. I just gestured with my head toward the queen-sized bed with the faded, flowery bedspread. It was completely covered, edge to edge, with paper. I had laid out every single document from the steel box, the deeds to homes and businesses across Havenwood, the controlling shares to companies they knew, companies they shopped at, the ownership papers for the firm that had fired my son, and in the very center, a single, recent bank statement showing a balance with more zeros than either of them had ever seen in one place. The silence in that room was absolute, broken only by a soft gasp from Travis. Brenda, all the color drained from her face. She walked slowly toward the bed, her eyes wide with disbelief, her hand fluttering to her mouth. She looked from the papers to me and back again. The arrogance, the defiance, it all just melted away, leaving behind a raw, stunned confusion. She had built her world on the idea of my weakness, and the foundation of that world had just turned to dust. I let them stand there for a good 5 minutes, letting the sheer weight of the truth press down on them. I spoke first to my son. "Travis," I said quietly, "whatever mistake you made, whatever she's been holding over your head for all these years, it ends today, right now. You don't have to live in fear of her anymore. I am your father. We will face whatever it is together." The look on his face, it was like watching a man take his first breath after nearly drowning. A great, shuddering sob escaped him. Brenda started to speak, to protest, but I held up a hand and my gaze silenced her. Then I looked at them both. "I forgive you," I said, and the words felt strange and clean in my mouth. "But forgiveness and forgetting are two different things. You will not go to a homeless shelter. You will not lose everything. You will go back to my house." I paused, letting the words sink in. "But from now on, you will live under my roof, and you will live by my rules. And the very first rule is this. The portrait of my Martha, your mother, is going to be hung back on the living room wall, right above the fireplace where it has always belonged." There were no arguments. There were no negotiations. We drove back to Havenwood in my old truck, the three of us in a heavy silence. That evening, Travis, with his own 2 hands, put the nail back in the wall, and hung his mother's picture. Brenda just watched, pale and quiet. It's not a storybook ending. The hurt doesn't vanish overnight, but it's a beginning. It's a chance. They are learning that respect isn't something you take from the weak, but something you earn from the strong. And I learned that money, for all its power, can't buy love or happiness. But sometimes, if you're lucky, it can buy you a second chance. It can buy you back your dignity, and it can give you the tools to rebuild a family on a truer, more solid foundation. Thank you for sitting with me through all this, for listening to an old man's story. It means more than you'll ever know. If you wouldn't mind, I'd surely love to see where you're all listening from. Leave a comment, tell me your city, your town. It makes this big old world feel a little bit smaller, a little warmer. And if you're so inclined, subscribe to the channel. There are a lot of stories that have been kept in the quiet for far too long, and it feels like it's finally time for them to be told.